All right, so we're thrilled today to have a special guest, Benjamin Ryan. He's an independent journalist who focuses on healthcare, public health, and science. He's written for a lot of major outlets, such as the New York Times, The Guardian, and NBC News, and has spent a lot of years reporting on, I believe, HIV and its impact, as well as gender medicine. So Benjamin, welcome to Dollcast. We're very excited to have you here today.
Great to be here, ladies.
We're so excited. Oh my God. Yeah. So I wanted to start off and say, just offer an apology because I feel like trans Twitter is so mean to you. I feel like they're so mean.
You're the representative of the Alejandro Caraballos of the world.
But sometimes have you ever had like that work situation where someone on your team was out of line and then is like the project manager, you had to go and like apologize for them. So that's kind of how I feel. The reason I like your work is I think if I made a list of the reporters that I think are doing like the best job of just straight down the middle reporting, you would 100% be on that list. And I think it is so frustrating, and it shows frankly, the intellectual bankruptcy of some people on our side that they spend so much time attacking you. I mean, how does that make you feel?
I mean, I know what my principles are, and I know where I stand, and it's really nice when people reflect back to me exactly what they are. You're spot on, and that is, my goal is to be a science journalist, and that, coming from the HIV reporting, which I've done since the beginning of my career, in the early 2000s, I started to see, indeed, when advocacy seeks into public health, sometimes their needs are aligned, but sometimes they conflict. So, it's my job not to parse those and not to just lean on the side of whatever some nonprofit might think I should say. Yeah. And so it is very bothersome to me in journalism as a whole. There was a piece that came out in The Guardian this week that was focusing really intently on the expert witnesses that testified in a lot of these cases about gender medicine ban for kids. And it was really scrutinizing how a lot of judges thought these guys were bunk and none of them had treated any trans people, or a lot of them hadn't. And it was extremely frustrating to me for two reasons. One, the reason this article was running was because it was suggesting that if the Supreme Court validates the Sixth District Court's decision that the Tennessee ban of gender-affirming care for kids is unconstitutional, or is constitutional, that this would be, in effect, validating all of these expert witnesses that they don't like. But the case doesn't even really hinge on that, for one thing. And two, I've read a lot of the briefs, which I don't think this reporter has, concerning this case, and they're really not about the strength of the science. They're more about legal questions to do with whether transgender kids or kids with gender dysphoria receiving these treatments count as a class, if it's sex-based discrimination, or if transgender kids count as what's called a quasi-suspect class under the law, justifying greater scrutiny of the law, whether it discriminates. So it was just sort of an excuse to run these guys through the mill, and put them through the meat grinder and criticize them. But if you read the briefs, they don't really refer much to the expert witnesses' statements. They refer to the fact that in Europe and the United Kingdom and the Cass Review, that all of these health authorities have brought up gender-affirming care for kids under scrutiny and questions, whether the science is strong. And so, and you can see there's James Cantor is a sex researcher in Canada. He's been one of these witnesses who've gone and testified on behalf of a lot of the bans. And you'll see in an email that got put online by Jesse Singal what James Cantor said to the Guardian journalist. He said, all of these other institutions have come to this conclusion about the strength of the science. The Guardian guy misquoted him and said that he said this, not all these institutions. And so you see how the sausage is made. Yeah. You see, they want to demonize a certain perspective, and there's this concept that the right, or whatever's right coded, is always incorrect about science. In this house, we believe in science. Sometimes, however, the right is correct, and I don't think that people on the left can really reconcile with that very well.
Sure. Well, what I want to do is, there are two conversations we could have today. I'm sure we could get into the meat of all of your reporting, which I would love to do. I think for right now, I just want to start with a more basic question, which is, why is it so hard for us structurally to have a nuanced conversation about this, because from my perception, I think there are two dueling cults here. I think you've got, Sky, what I think you've brought me around on calling gender ideology, this kind of extremist trans view. Let's abolish gender, self-ID, abolish medical standards without science to justify it, like open up all care as quickly as possible, don't look at any of the downsides. That's kind of the gender ideology side. I think on the other, you have what I could very charitably call the gender critical side, which is really it's a harassment cult that does have a seed of valid public policy objection there. Like, we do need a system for how, trans women use the restroom. That is a reasonable thing to have a conversation about. But all too often, like, I've probably gotten 1,000 comments about my vagina in the last, day on Twitter, which is just weird and gross and inappropriate, which is what this devolves into. So, like, from your perspective, like, what are the structural barriers that you see for someone like you going out and just giving a straight reporting? Like, here's what the clinics are doing, here's what the times are, here's what the criteria are, here's who's funding it, here's the information. So as citizens, we can make a valid, like, public policy choice here. How can we, like, move away from the extremes and get to the meat of a substantive conversation? What do you need from the public to be able to do your work with less bullshit? I think I would say.
I think that, two major factors, I think, have enforced extreme opinions rising to the top. And one is gerrymandering within congressional districts. So it makes it much harder for someone who doesn't have an extreme opinion to the left or right to win a primary, because all you need to do is win a primary. So I think that's a big part of the problem. I think that social media, obviously, as we all know, the algorithm favors rage and division, and so that gets people going and gets people engaged. Those apps are there to keep you engaged. Twitter pays people who have large followings based on engagement, so there's a lot of incentives in there. So, and then more specifically, GLAAD in particular, HRC, Lambda Legal, ACLU, these big nonprofit groups, some of which are very specifically LGBTQ, and then ACLU, of course, has that as a division. They're not out there looking for nuance. And I was listening the other day to Ezra Klein's podcast, and he was talking with some expert about this idea that the Democratic Party, that a lot of the local bosses, a lot of that work that used to be more within the actual Democratic structure has been outsourced to nonprofits. So I think that GLAAD is really effectively speaking for the Democratic Party. And when people puzzle over this idea, what is this? Kamala Harris never mentioned trans people on when she was out there campaigning during those 100 days that she was on the trail. And that's true. And then she was asked about it a couple of times and she evaded, with that idea of like, I'll just follow the law. But what people I think are reacting to is a larger structure. GLAAD is an extremist organization when it comes to trans issues. It's extremely inflexible. And then the way that it has come after the New York Times and other institutions, and me in particular, really is quite illiberal, and it suppresses an even discussion of this. The idea that anyone, much less a major nonprofit institution that rakes in millions of dollars a year, should park a truck outside of a major news organization, as GLAAD did, with a sign that says the science is settled about anything, is completely amazing to me. So I have a pretty unique position. Back, hey,
hey, Taff, welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back.
Thank you.
It was 2 years ago that I really started getting invested in the trans kids issue and started reading about it all the time. And so I spent a lot of last year trying to find left-leaning liberal institutions, media institutions, to take my work. And they all said no. And the bottom line is they were all too afraid to. And what they're afraid of GLAAD, they're afraid of Twitter, they're afraid of the pushback. These people don't want to lose their jobs. And especially in a time when the media is shrinking, there are layoffs, people become more risk averse. And a lot of what editors are thinking when they decide whether or not to greenlight an article is we must protect the institution of our publication above all else. So it makes for less courage in producing, risky journalism per se.
I hear you though, but I mean, don't you think there's a criticism for the other side as well? I mean, there is. I know you have faced all kinds of harassment just for like gendering me correctly. Like what my gender is on my driver's license. I do not see the same structural incentives for the generously calling them the gender critical movement. There's a real mission, I feel, to amplify science. Like, here's a really good example. You're seeing AGP used as a shorthand for degenerate that cannot transition well and never belongs in a women's space.
Pervert.
Right, exactly. And, I'm not going to say AGP does not have a difficult road at times, but, I think it's just inaccurate to say these are not people that need gender affirming care like a lot of, other trans people do. So I do not see that project working both ways.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a big question of how much of the right, when it comes to the bans on gender transition treatment for kids, how much of that is authentic and a real belief that they are genuinely protecting children, and how much of that is cynical. After gay marriage is passed, all of those efforts to use that as a wedge issue died. Some time passed. Oh, here's another great issue that we can use to rally the base. Jeremy Peters wrote a good story about this in the New York Times last year. But I do think that those two things do overlap. And having spoken with some of these lawmakers, the way they talk about it isn't necessarily entirely in a way that you would consider pejorative or demeaning. It really is centered on the idea of protecting children from something that they do sincerely believe is harmful, and that they believe that the science backs them up.
Sure.
But yes, I think especially in England, the TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, their movement is remarkably inflexible. But one can also argue that is being provoked from the left. These people, they were more flexible before, but they've been pushed so much that it has radicalized them.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like there's two extremes here, like we've been talking about. But I feel like what really bothers me is really the failures of WPATH, which I feel like you've really covered. Yeah. And it's undermines our credibility from the standpoint of oh yeah, transition can help some people. But when you have this approach that you can't challenge them, and you have to always meet in the middle, and you have people in situations that there's clear mental health issues going on, and you're still being okay, how can we get them HRT and get them down this pathway? It's why are you even considering the pathway when you could diagnose and treat these other conditions first and possibly rule that out? I felt like your recent article, I think it was the WPATH audio leak or something like that. Yeah, it was so eye-opening to this.
It was really interesting. So what she's referring to is somebody leaked me a video from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH's recent conference in Lisbon. And it was just basically just a video meeting like we're having now. And it was a group of practitioners from a gender clinic in Connecticut. And they were giving case studies of 3 different cases of what they consider the more quote unquote nuanced, which was a euphemism that they were using for not too clear-cut cases of people who are most definitely gender dysphoric and transgender and would definitely be helped by transitioning medications. And so you see them dancing around it and just never wanting to admit that they were even thinking of saying no to people. One guy was on antipsychotic medication, another guy was bigender and hadn't told their wife that they had 2 genders and wanted breasts. And this was obviously going to create a serious problem at home that maybe this person should work out before looking into getting breast implants and taking estrogen. So it was very interesting to say that they call themselves partners on this person's gender journey. And the real question is, there's this history in medicine of the doctor being very paternalistic. So there's been a shift in recent years to try to move that more towards shared decision making. But the fact of the matter is, the doctor has the authority and they have the prescription pad. So it's not an even balance, but they're trying to even it out. But this is suggesting almost that the patient is really leading the way and the doctor is really in the service economy. So is there a role, and I know that you've spoken a lot about this, that you really support, Brianna, the classic gatekeeping that has fallen away in recent years, that like Florence Ashley, the law expert at the University of Alberta is really opposed to and says is harmful. And so that's the real debate of what role does gatekeeping have, and what role does the science have in telling us whether the gatekeeping is helpful or not. And there are so many unanswered questions, in particular about kids these days.
Well, I think, Ben, this is where I'm really torn on this. So when I transitioned, I got out of rehab. So the hard drugs I was using, I was off of that. I was still drinking too much, right? Just trying to get these thoughts of being a woman out of my head, right? I wouldn't say I had depression, but I was really severe social anxiety. I had comorbidities, right? Now, the instant literally that I got on HRT, Like, I have not felt a need to drink a single day since completely. I could go out right now and go on a 3-week bender and just stop instantly. Like, the core cause for like that addiction, that social anxiety is treated, right? So I think it's a fine line that you have to draw with the doctor. Like, where does, do you know what I mean? At what point is the comorbidity driven by gender dysphoria, or to what point do you need to fix it first, right? I think like it's really tricky, but I also see it the other way. Like, there's a discussion like legitimately happening on my Twitter yesterday with people talking like, what? Some people are poor. You think you're expecting them to go on HRT when that's $30 a month? I'm like, sweetheart, like, transition is the most expensive thing you're ever going to do in your life. If you think it's only going to cost you if you can't swing $30 a month, you are not going to have a successful time.
It's because there's this prevailing notion that it's a right to transition.
Right.
And that is like I don't want to say it's like the toxic source, but that's what's infiltrating. That's the essence of gender ideology that's working its way in WPATH, where they're afraid to, it's funny because they're conscious too. They're like, we're not just here to hand out hormones. We're here to help get an assessment on the drivers. And like, they'll play the language, but at the end of the day, they're too afraid to be seen as a gatekeeper. And so they're going to prescribe the medication, even if it's not a good fit. And there's other solutions that could be had. And it's like, the problems run deep. And I think it has a lot to do with this ideology.
I mean, here's the thing. I think that the entire notion of trans rights is predicated on this medical argument that like the reason why trans women ought to be allowed to play in women's sports is because they have a fundamental medical need to transition. And it's not just like a lifestyle thing. It's not just like a cosmetic thing. And we have pushed this argument so far that now there's a real feeling within progressive circles, which is maybe somewhat justified, that if you tell someone like, oh, you know, you maybe shouldn't transition or you don't have a medical need, we have these like nuanced cases where there isn't clear history of like long-term gender dysphoria. The political apparatus built up around that has basically made it so what you're telling someone is, you know, you have no political right to engage with this gender and no one needs to respect you because, you know, everyone else has this medical reason and you maybe don't. I really think that the solution here is to move towards a model which bases rights on freedom and self-expression and to enable people to express themselves freely, but then also with that, you have to accept certain consequences. Like maybe not everyone wants to gender you correctly. Maybe, you know, you don't get access to women's sports teams. Like you have to accept that trade-off. And we've just pushed so far in one direction, which is maybe acceptable for some people. You know, science, I think, is evolving on this. But it's so clear that we've just, you know, we've reached the end of the road a little bit on the political capital around this.
I agree.
What exactly is that?
Oh,
well, sorry, I just wanted to...
I was going to say I wanted to hear from Kelly, so go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I hear you guys keep bringing up the science, and it's just like, you know, I don't really know like what that is, because it seems like a lot of like the signs of gender dysphoria and diagnosing someone with that is all based off of things you say and feelings. I just don't really feel like it's advanced that much at all. To me, it's kind of like, how do you prove someone's gay? You know, you can't really do that either. It's just based off of someone saying, well, I'm attracted to this. So, I mean, I feel like anyone could go and follow the W path and like say the right things in order to get that diagnosis. And I think that's...
And they do. They look up online. It's very common. You know?
They do.
I think when my parents caught me making out with that boy when I was 12, that was pretty sad.
There was something going on. Yeah. Well, okay, there are like revealed preferences, right? Like people who spend tens of thousands of dollars on surgery, you know, it's a pretty good indicator that they really value this thing. And I mean, you ask like David Hume, he would say like, you can't prove anything, right? Like it's all like, maybe the sun will rise tomorrow, maybe not. You know, you're getting to like a real problem, which is, it's very hard to tell what's going on actually in someone's head. You know, how do I know someone's conscious? How do I know they see the same colors as me? Totally legitimate. But, you know, I think in medicine, we generally accept that like you can diagnose depression. You can tell, you know, if someone has gotten better by taking an SSRI. I mean, maybe it's not like the highest, you know, it's not like physics level of evidence, but I think that
They're
it's
validated measures for measuring.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Totally.
Brianna, you talked a lot about how the criteria in the DSM for diagnosing gender dysphoria has expanded. The bar has been lowered.
Expanded is a nice word for lowered to nothing. I think it's been shrunken, actually, where there's no
again, Brianna, I don't think it's necessarily like a problem if people are getting easy access to HRT, but the problem is that the doctors are taking a lot of responsibility for that, right? So by prescribing it and making it this thing where like we expect the doctor to validate the gender dysphoria in order to give out the prescription, suddenly we're not treating it like cosmetic surgery. Mm-hmm. Suddenly we're treating it as the doctor is actually staking like a claim that this person needs this medication to improve in mental health, and they need to be integrated in society as a woman in order to feel positively, to live a successful life, which maybe that's not necessarily true for all cases. And so, I think this lower level of evidential standard, that's okay, but we need to be really honest if we are lowering that and say like, okay, freedom to control your body, but like maybe that doesn't extend into other people's freedom.
But also differentiating between the ethics of an adult, somebody who's in their late 20s, let's say, who has been gender dysphoric for many, many years, versus a child, who hasn't even gone to puberty yet, hasn't had that kind of sexual awakening that might help them reconcile with gender versus sexual identity, if there's a push and pull there. And I think a lot of people look at this fairly simplistically. M. Gesson had this quite famous now op-ed in the New York Times this week, in which they argued essentially, which is they had also said to David Rebnick in the New Yorker interview last year, that kids make all kinds of decisions. And I think that that's a real false equivalence. And in the New Yorker, they refer to things like joining the ROTC or taking a lot of debt for school. And Gesson was trying to argue essentially that the Republicans being concerned with the long-term fertility needs or potential of young people is a kind of control, on the par with banning abortion or, Putin controlling people's reproductive rights. And I think that's missing the forest for the trees a bit. It's not that they're trying to control, but they're trying to preserve this person's options for what has been long considered a human right, given the mistakes that were made in the eugenics movement and sterilizing the quote-unquote mentally incompetent, that sort of thing. We as a society have concluded this based on past errors, but so much of we must repair the past efforts that are being undertaken by the people who one could call gender ideologists, is we must not do to trans people what we did to the gays. And I think that's also fairly simplistic. And I think that, gender identity, I think, is harder to make sense of and wrap your head around than at least for guys, for whether they're gay or not. Because there is a good test of whether you're gay, and it happens to be attached to your body.
What we were saying earlier, that there's no one way to measure with confidence that someone is gonna be happy with a transgender, with that pathway.
It's very hard to remove all false positives.
Well,
I mean, Kelly, I'd really like to hear some of your, thoughts and experiences, how this is for you, having been through this at a young age. And as I gather, you're very happy with having done it as a young age. So how does that influence your perception of whether this is a good idea for other young people?
It's a tough question for me, just because, I like to think I'm one of the lucky ones, just because I've seen so many people that did transition at a young age that did regret it. But then at the same time, people on the far left will present me with quote unquote evidence, which I'm not sure how valid it is or not, that, the majority of people who did transition as kids are like me. They don't have regrets. But, it's just nowadays, you can't believe any study you see, because it's just you never know if it's biased or not, I kind of disagree with Taff a little bit when she says HRT shouldn't be gate kept, because I do feel like it's just caused so many issues.
Not what I said. I'm okay with less gatekeeping as long as we, responsibility falls on the right people.
Yeah, don't. Yeah, go ahead.
I just kind of feel like you guys are so adults should have access to it, but kids shouldn't, and that's a lot of people's hard line. At least when I see a lot of right-wing extremists talk on Twitter. But to me, me, it's like, I just kind of feel like for everybody, regardless if you transitioned at 15, like I did, or if you're transitioning at like 50, it should just be like a really slow, hard process to even start a medical transition, just because I don't feel like it's an easy decision for anyone at any age. It's such like a big thing.
But what about the fact that puberty is oncoming and you're trying to beat that? Doesn't that inevitably rush the decision? That's the conundrum.
Sometimes I think I wonder if maybe transition, or if I had just let my puberty continue further, who's to say maybe I wouldn't have wanted to transition and testosterone would have taken over. I don't know the answer to that question, but I know that I'm happy now, and I know that I love my life this way, but who's to say if my parents were more conservative and they didn't allow that to take place, if I wouldn't have grown out of it.
I mean, before affirmation therapy took the stage, it was a watchful waiting approach. I mean, that's what Ken Zucker in his clinic up in Toronto did for so long, until activists basically looked for a case where, he wasn't transitioning kids, and, jumped on that and then got him shut down. But that was sort of the standard. Like, we didn't have to make it illegal in like areas to do this. It was just a very thorough, regimented approach based on time. Because there's no good criteria, we need the time component to sort of help assess that persistent motivation. And I think by the time you reach adults, it's a little bit different. But I do think that, the goal of good therapy and medicine shouldn't be to just affirm a patient's feelings. It should be to gently challenge them, explore them, and help them reach the conclusions of what they're, what's going to best benefit them.
The problem that I have with the term gender affirming care is it presumes that the care is affirming the correct gender. Yeah. And so it's baked in, it has baked in a bias. And then you'll hear people try to twist their words around, afterwards they didn't detransition, they retransitioned. And we're still affirming their gender because now their gender is just something else. That would be nice if there were entire structure and an insurance system in place to help detransitioners, which there isn't. But I think that's a very cynical misuse of language. And so that's why I tend to use gender transition treatment, which I feel is a more neutral term.
That's fair.
And that's something that's important to me as a journalist. And I don't like the term sex assigned at birth because I feel it's scientifically inaccurate. And I think it's important to differentiate between sex and gender, because is not what all of you ladies have done, as I gather, by going on HRT, working against your natal sex. That's a part of the process. So deny that is just sort of deny what you're actually doing. And I think that's perfectly fine.
I do feel like I have to say that testosterone didn't work out for me very well either. I was not exactly a Duke from G.I. Joe. I didn't really take with that super well either.
But I think that your sex is one thing, but your gender is another.
That's totally fair. I do feel like I want to give just a little bit of pushback on what y'all are saying, because I feel like out of everyone here, I'm the only one that's seen the other side of the book, like what happens when you don't get gender affirming care. And I made the decision to start transitioning when I was 25. And I can tell you what I saw from the people that were, 30, 40, 50 and on up in the trans community that chose not to transition. There was a very, very large cohort of fetishistic cross-dressers. They were universally married, and they had some really scary attitudes towards women. I'm just going to be honest. You had the closet cases. These are AGPs that just basically suppressed it their whole life. They would then spend all their time online in these communities trying to suppress this. They had a male persona, and they had like this real melancholy inside of them from like suppressing this side of themselves all of the time. And they had a lot of excuses. I cannot do this for my children or my wife. Like all of them were into like women. And I cannot think of a single person I've ever met in my entire life that is into men in any kind of serious way and did not transition and regretted it in any way. I've literally never run across that. So it's like, I'm not trying to belittle anyone's feelings here. I'm just saying, like, Kelly, you're a fairly feminine woman. Like, you just are. And I think if, like, I don't know. I think, like, I'm open to giving people time to figure this stuff out. But one of the reasons I really like the gender affirming care model or the old school way of doing things is at every step, it requires something from the patient. like getting buy-in, getting agency, and then it gives you something in return. You commit to 3 months of therapy, then you get hormones. You get on hormones, you can then go to a doctor, take that agency, get your endocrinology check, see if levels are in the right way, then you can start RLE. Do RLE, get a full-time job, then you can start looking at vaginoplasty. So I think like this is something I would really love to stress to all of y'all is I really thought like you've got to understand it was an eye blink ago that insurance did not cover anything. Like I paid for every dime of transition myself. And I always thought the moment Obamacare covered vaginoplasty and FFS and hormones, I thought that would just be utopia for trans people. And I thought we would all end up well adjusted. It's clearly not happened. And I think about this all the time. Why does the trans community have so much more opportunity to go live better lives than ever before? Anything I ever dreamed of in my whole life. But we are more chaotic and more psychologically unhealthy and more miserable than ever before. And the only answer I can come to is we are letting people in that are not served by these treatments. Like, I can't think of anything else because the people like you, Sky, you had this stuff paid for in a way I didn't. And like, you turned out normal. So I think the answer, Taff, is
okay. I turned out normal.
More normal. More normal.
I don't know. I'm pretty crazy.
Yeah.
I live with 12 cats, Bree.
Well, I was just gonna say, are you a cat lady? You're a cat lady.
I am. I'm a crazy cat lady.
Yeah.
No, but there is a truth to this, though. That, you know, I did benefit from having these procedures, from having a good medical pathway of a lot of these procedures being facilitated and it benefiting me. But I do think that the actual therapeutic model of gender affirmation wasn't actually helpful to me. I mean, before I ever made the decision transition, I deep dove into the critical narratives of what were the best criticisms of this approach. And that was really what helped me make the decision because I needed to be sure, absolutely sure, like, is this really what I want to do? Because this is a one-way street.
What were those criticisms? Like, what did you read or who did you listen to?
I went into like detransitioner narratives and the trans widow narratives, like partners of mostly trans women that, you know, were divorced from that. And I just saw like kind of like snippets and snapshots of what life could look like for someone in my situation, or like what basically like, you know, what are the different like ways that life could manifest down the road for me. And I realized like I need to get this solved now and I need to get this ironed out. And then the question became do I want to medicalize my transition or am I happy being sort of in between with like feminine expression and like lots of open cross-dressing and femininity when it comes to painting my nails and like having longer hair. And through that process, again, through like taking time and processing each step, I realized like, I don't think being perceived. So I was basically perceived as a gay man for about a year before I actually went on HRT. And I was like, I don't think this is where my target is. Like, I don't think this is where I want to land. I want to go the full step and medicalize my transition. And as soon as, kind of like Bree said, as soon as I started HRT, it clicked for me. And I was like, this is the way. Like, this works for me. and then I went, and I'm super happy today. But I also recognize like there's always going to be some people that will think I am a man or male, and I need to be okay with this as part of my decision. And that's the part of gender affirming therapy that I really despise, because I feel like they say, oh, you feel this way? You're a woman inside, and everyone ought to treat you that way. And if they don't, they're in the wrong. And that to me is setting people up for this problem of being so unhappy when things come out and people don't agree with it. And
also, how does that bleed into the just general like plastic surgery culture? Is that a part of it? I used to watch every episode of Dr. 90210, and it always had the same storyline. This person had a personal problem unrelated to their body that was going to be solved through plastic surgery. In the end, they were always presented as cured of their problem, whatever it might be. They were shy, or they couldn't find a boyfriend or something like that. Their career would change. And so does that mindset also influence people's gender dysphoria and their desire to transition? But we can't have these discussions because that runs up against the danger zone of anyone saying that anyone's feelings about their own gender identity aren't anything but totally gender essentialist valid.
Oh.
So that's the discussions that we're having here now, you know. And just the question, if I went and had, if I had a big nose and wanted this little small one, like, would I really be happy with it, you know?
Mm-hmm. Good. No, I think that's a great point.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. I think the big difference is that our culture sort of understands that oftentimes plastic surgery is not the answer to people's problems. We can be very honest about that. And I think a big issue with gender affirming care is that we just cannot be honest about it, like you're saying. And so gender transition is treated as something that like absolutely will help you. And to say otherwise is total anathema. It's going to get you thrown out of the room. And I think that more than that as well, there's just this expectation that if you transition, like everyone needs to be fully on board with that. And if they're not,
or they're
transphobic. They're transphobic.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's a detriment to you as a person, to your ability to survive. You know, that's causing suicides and death. And the reality is we're setting trans people up for failure because we're instilling this mentality of like total fragility where everyone needs to be affirming you. Otherwise you're fucked. That's just not the case. Like, people are so much more resilient than they realize. And so I think that we're, you know, Brianna, she mentioned that it seems like trans people are in some ways more miserable than ever. I think it's because, you know, we've moved to this perspective where more and more we're putting the responsibility on everyone else.
External validation.
And people are just, they're seeking value in other people's minds. I saw a TikTok the other day. Someone was saying that like they get gendered correctly, she, her, all the time, but they just know in their heads that the other person in their head is really thinking he, him. And I cannot imagine a more toxic way to approach the world. Where you're engaging in this mind reading and it's not even good enough for someone to refer to you with the right pronouns. You need to like know that in their head they believe it.
So a few things I would say. So Laura Edwards-Leeper, you're probably familiar with her. So she was part of the team that imported the Dutch model to Boston Children's in 2007. The first clinic ever to open to give pediatric gender transition treatment. And so she is a psychologist, and in recent years, she's become more of a skeptic from within that who's concerned about some of these excesses that we're talking about. She really believes in very thorough assessments, you know, spending like 20 hours all told, speaking with the kid, writing a huge report for the parents, that sort of thing. So I asked her for an article I was writing for the New York Post recently about what the future of the trans movement for kids is in the United States. And I said, you know, if it comes to pass that because of the insurance climate, legal climate, that kids aren't going to be able to access blockers and hormones increasingly if they want them, how is that going to impact all these kids? And she said something that totally amazed me. She said, well, I've worked with a lot of these kids who can't get these meds either because of the state law or because one or both their parents says no. And eventually they come to terms with it and they just realize they have to wait. And my jaw hit the floor because this was something like totally normal to hear, but you're not allowed to say it. That these kids, you know, by and large, will be resilient. And this narrative that they will definitely kill themselves bothers me so much. And I speak this as somebody, I spent much of my life suicidal. I know about this feeling. It is the worst feeling in the world. It is a constant drumbeat that you would be better off not existing. It is extremely painful. But we know from suicide research that talking about it in a simplistic way and discussing a simplistic cause and effect can influence people's suicide. And the discourse about this, the way that Next Benedict was discussed, that case was very complicated. You know, if you listen to the recording in the hospital with the cop when X is being interviewed, Next instigated the fight, but also Next's father, who was abusive, had recently got out of prison or something. There was a lot going on in this kid's life, more than just what happened in that bathroom. And for the media and for GLAAD, everyone to capitalize on that and to fundraise off of that, it was really just totally inexcusable to me. And one other thing I wanted to say is that Anna Hutchinson was also a psychologist who came from this movement and was part of the Gender Identity Development System, or GIDS, at the NHS in the UK, the clinic that started in about 2011 and was shut down last year. And she became a whistleblower. She felt that they were not using the proper guide rails, that they were being reckless, that they were using the ideology as opposed to science. And I spoke with her the other day, and she said something that really surprised me. She said, right now, as we're discussing here, no one is even trying to research a way to properly anticipate whether kids will be permanently gender dysphoric when they're going into this medicalized system, or whether they have a permanent trans identity. No one's even trying to research this, right? Yeah. And to the contrary, people like Jack Turbin from UCSF and Diane Arensaf, also at that institution, they published a paper on how to do these assessments according to the WPATH rules. The very first thing they say is this is not to determine if the kid is really trans. And I'm so shocked by that, but should not be, to put it more clinically, should not be the purpose to assess whether they'll be permanently gender dysphoric. And so Dr. Hutchinson told me, she said, because of this, because there is no proper way to predict who will be the Kelly in this situation and who might be, say, me. And of course, as you said, who knows, maybe you would have been me in another life, but is it better or worse? These are important questions to ask. But Dr. Hutchinson told me that she said, absent that system that could accurately predict how these kids will turn out ultimately, she didn't think that gender transition for kids was ethical, even in a clinical trial, because there's too much risk. And I thought that was, I would be curious to know what you guys think of that position, which is very strong. And this is coming from somebody who knows the system. Yeah. So they are a very informed source. So I mean, call that a radical position, perhaps.
So I hear what you're saying. Yeah. I just want to say this. I hear what you're saying. I think that's valid. I'm sure if an alternate history existed where my family had let me, start social transition when I was 16 and didn't care that I was interested in boys and let me express myself, I'm sure I would have survived till I made it to 18, though I still would have had to have a tremendous amount of plastic surgery and still be too tall. This is the part of it, and respectfully, this is what I think you miss, and this is why I worry about the political project I think sometimes you're part of. So if you look through all of human history, boys that want to be girls are part of human history through 3,000 years of recorded history. And we've always existed, we'll always exist. And typically society does not treat us very well. We are universally a sex working class or a lower class that is looked down on doing menial labor. There's just the history of trans people. And I think it's really easy to say stuff people will, they'll survive till they're 18. But the problem is the culture of the political project. If that was a sacrifice we were truly making and we were really getting those kids help, I might be more amenable to it, but that's not the game. J.K. Rowling is engaged in a political project to dehumanize trans people. She just is.
She didn't used to. I listened to the witch trials, and she wasn't then, but she is now. Absolutely
radicalized, and I know firsthand how being a cult figure in one of these identity cults will radicalize you.
And there was that trans person who was a referee for some little sports league in the middle of nowhere in England. She just sent all the Furies all over the.
It's insane.
Oh,
it's insane.
No.
I mean, what for?
Sure. But my point is, I feel like it's actually very similar to Israel-Palestine in the sense that the victim abuser order is being switched here by a political project, because it's trans people, historically, do not have political power. Trans people historically are
They're arguing that in the Supreme Court right now. That is a key argument about whether they count as a quasi-suspect class, women. Women are counted as quasi-suspect class, which means that if there's a law that discriminates against them, it's a much higher bar to cross to say whether or not it is a valid form of criticism. So that is up for debate very much in the highest court of the land right now.
Yeah. Well, I wish they'd been smarter about the case.
Clarify, I don't see myself, I would hate for people to think, and many people do, but that I'm a part of a political project, and that I'm arguing on behalf of Dr. Hutchinson or Dr. Laura Edward Leeper. I do make certain editorial decisions about which voices to highlight and which I don't think deserve the light of day, perhaps. but it is not my role to argue those positions myself, but to spotlight them.
I think that I consider you a friend. I love talking to you. I respect your work. I do think you have a point of view, and I think sophisticated media consumer can read your work. And like the person you just chose, like you wrote an article with me in it as a dissenting voice, and then you chose to put the person you just mentioned that said those kids will survive if you make them wait till 18. Right. You dedicated like 3 paragraphs highlighting them at the end. And to me, that reads as, this is my point of view. This is the conclusion the reader should draw. That's fine. It's honest journalism. I'm just saying, I do think you have a point of view, and it comes across in your work. Yeah,
I hear you. But I do try to temper it the best I can.
Yeah, I think you do.
I was just going to say, I think everyone has a point of view, but when it comes to Benjamin's work, I find it so balanced. And actually, it's remarkably balanced to me because I'm like, I see you taking flack for gendering, I guess correct gendering or whatever of trans people, but people will come at you and I'm just like, oh my gosh.
I kind of enjoy it a little bit when they go crazy because I don't care and I just mute those threads. Sometimes, and I'll be like, let's stir up some trouble. And I'll just say, it is unkind to misgender transgender people.
Yeah.
And it'll get 500,000 views and 1,200 angry comments. And I'm just going about my day. I don't hear it, and because I also don't care. And they say we're gonna unfollow and block you, and I go and block a lot of them because you people are just annoying. I mean, if nothing else. Yeah. And I really disagree because, and I agree with that since that is my sincere belief that it is unkind for me to call any of you men. For one thing, would require so much cognitive dissonance. I'm looking at you and men? No, that's ridiculous.
So, wild to me how it flipped from it was 180 because it used to be, you're not allowed to misgender a trans person on the platforms. And now it's the other way. And it's this language policing pendulum.
Well, what they're saying is that if I call any of you she, I am making a political statement about your sex. Therefore, you have a right to be in the following single-sex spaces, and that is a threat to women. That's the extension of that argument. I don't agree with it, that slippery slope. And I think that's when you hear people like Veronica Ivy or recently Zoe Zephyr saying, I am a biological woman, that's a political argument that is saying I am totally inflexible about the argument whether I have a right to be in these single-sex spaces. And I think that causes a radical reaction from the TERFs. We're going to start calling you he because we don't think you belong there. And that way you can't have a nuanced discussion about what's the threat if you're both just peeing? There's stalls, there are other people around. Is there any evidence of these horrible attacks that you're discussing even happening? Or is this just a boogeyman,
Do you have any place to say that trans women are biologically women instead of biologically female, just in the sense that, we are born with the dysphoria that makes us feel like we are women? So not to say we're female, but just being born with that dysphoria biologically, not
that's
we
an interesting way of putting
women.
I think we need language, as I was saying earlier, just to be clear of what sex versus gender is. So what I think I'm hearing you say is the way I would put it is that your gender and your sex is different. And that's part of the problem. That tension is what causes the dysphoria. And then the HRT or just cross-sex hormone, so however you're going to put it, that's to work against and to reconcile that conflict. So to me, it's illogical to say that the sex is different because then you wouldn't need all that treatment. You wouldn't have to have had all this plastic surgery. You just would have been a woman.
I think, and Kelly, I know you can agree with me on this. The grossness of the way that TERFs and gender criticals talk about my body, it is beyond anything any man that found out I was trans has ever spoken to me before. Kelly, I've seen them do this to you, do thread hundreds of comments talking about if you have a vagina or not. Yeah, I think a really good analog would be what if someone had breast cancer, had reconstructive surgery, and someone going with them and going well, do you really have breasts? Can you really call an implant a breast? You had you had all your breast tissue removed. Are you really a woman? I mean, it's look, I understand that this is something surgically created, but it's really none of your business. And there's no need to say stuff like this. really
What do
gross.
you say to
Yeah.
the argument, it is my business if this person is naked in front of me and has a penis in
That's
the
fair.
locker room? So what do you say to that?
Well, I don't think any cis woman should ever see a penis in a locker room. That is beyond, like, the fact that that's even on a table shows how crazy the ideology has gotten. When I transitioned 20 years ago, you never would have found any trans woman that ever would have even been in that space pre-op in the first place. So the fact that that's on the table today just shows how entitled and male-coded this version of activism is. Like, I don't identify with it at all. I'm post-op. I don't even use like locker rooms. And it's like, it's not that I'm like afraid or like for political reasons. I've just got that still like 12-year-old shame about my body.
Do you feel like
that's never
maybe you
gone
still
away.
don't belong? Is that part of like that?
No, it's just like I didn't
transphobia or
like
whatever?
I didn't like being around boys when I was naked because I felt such shame, and that's just never changed, right? So I just shower at home and skip the whole thing. If that makes sense.
To your point, so I've had testicular cancer. So one of them is a prosthesis. So am I half a man?
Right, 100%.
It's a little ridiculous. But I think what you're getting at about this like identity and what makes someone a man or a woman, I mean, one of the arguments from the trans rights side is that the pronouns and the dress and the identity and what's happening in the brain is what makes you a woman. And so I think the reason why sometimes TERFs are saying like, I don't want to use your pronouns is because everyone has sort of bought into this belief system that the pronouns are what legitimize participating in women's sports or using the word restroom. It's because everyone's operating on this kind of like social version of gender, which is, I think, kind of ridiculous. And so I think we just need to get outside of that paradigm and say, like, just describe things accurately. Like you're saying, trans women, they prefer to be gendered she and
also
Oh,
her.
trans women are they're a different kind of a woman, and that's okay. That's just reality. Trans women are women. I'm like, well, yes, but like in a different way, and it's okay to discuss
And that way is relevant for some things like sports. Like there's a different biology here. So, I mean, earlier we talked about like, should gender hormones be more gate kept? I think fundamentally all of this, so many of these conversations, they come down to who is bearing the responsibility of this decision? Who is it affecting?
Well, sometimes in a court of law, if they're sued, that will be reconciled. That will be decided. So, and there are a lot of lawsuits against, detransitioner lawsuits, about 24. And they're not all kids. Some of them are, the oldest one is 29. So
here's the thing. I think doctors, if they are experiencing these lawsuits, suddenly that's a really big incentive for the medical professionals to gatekeep a lot more because if they're going to be held responsible, they don't want to mess up, right? And so I think that like, if you're in a world where the trans person, the person wanting to transition, holds all the responsibility for taking those hormones, then I think the bar for accessing those hormones should be really low. But I also think that like you as a person who might want to transition, there's a reason why you might want to speak to a doctor, and it's because you care about getting a good outcome, at least in theory. And so you should want that gatekeeping to make sure that you're the right candidate for hormones. And you should want to, not impose upon, you shouldn't want to like flash your penis in a locker room because when you're entering someone else's space. And all of this for me just comes down to you should bear the responsibility of things and not impose that outcome on other people in whatever scenario.
But Taff, let's be honest, like this version of the trans community is allergic to any kind of personal responsibility or agency. It's exactly as you said, the culture has moved 100% away from, like, we can't even get trans gals in the voice train. Like, like it's 100% like, let's make it so society will recognize all this stuff and no agency on the person itself. It is, I don't know how we would change that culture. I legitimately don't.
Bree, this is like that slogan, you don't need dysphoria to be trans.
Yes, which is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
So let me play devil's advocate, because I hear people pushing back against you, Brown, a lot, to saying like what you're doing is you're policing trans identity so that only you would get in the door. And that's not fair. There's so many people who are somewhere in the middle who just want to be kind of a woman, kind of a man, or they're non-binary and they're going to have breast implants but not take HRT. So what's wrong with that, essentially? Why shouldn't they be allowed to make those choices for themselves? Okay. Why do they have to pass or something?
I'm really glad you asked this question. So
that's a great question.
Yeah. I'm not saying this is my opinion, but I hear this a lot.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I've thought about this so much. And I think they're like, my understanding of trans has like radically expanded in the last 2 years. And I think there are a lot of different gateways to being trans. And I don't think we're all the same thing. I think the thing that gender identity dysphoria picked up on the 80s that I have is a super, super specific kind of gateway to being trans. That's kind of the old school that has existed through all of human history.
Very rare, like mostly natal males.
About 0.01%. Kelly, as best as I can tell from knowing you, you're the exact same thing as I am. Yeah. And we just are this hyper rare, interested in boys, understanding this at a really young age, like thing that exists. And I think it is expanded, and I don't have a problem with the way it's expanded. Like, I understand that there are some non-binary people that are going to exist. I understand that there are some like more fetishistic cross-dressers that are going to want to experiment with their public presentation in real life. That's fine. But to me, the public policy concern is, should insurance pay for that stuff? Should you have access to women's spaces? Like, what are your legal rights?
That's when it affects other people.
Exactly.
People paying for it, or impacting their feelings of safety, whatever it is.
So I'm with you, Taff, in those situations. Should they have the freedom to do it? Hell yeah, this is America. I love freedom. That's great. But I think like they are on a fundamentally different pathway and have a fundamentally different problem than I do. These people with autism, particularly, I've looked so deeply into the trans women with autism and the way they're different than what I have is. And there's some pertinent public policy discussions there. So maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong, but my jam is public policy. And I think it has to start with protecting the people that need it the most, which are the ones that have a medical case of this. We have to transition. We have to move on with life. This is not a social project. It is literally the oldest version of this that we can identify. Does that argument make sense to you?
Yeah.
But do you not think that kind of contributes to the problem that we were talking about a little bit earlier, just when it comes to like who actually is trans? Because I don't know if we would call these people trans, or I don't know, I guess they go by non-binary now, but I would like to think specifically in the cases of trans women like you and me, Bree, who are attracted to men only, because I know Sky and Taff are bisexual, I believe. When it comes to us who are straight, oh, you're straight. Okay. Sorry. But it's like, I would think a real way to know if someone's trans, at least how it would probably be back in the day, especially when you were transitioning, Bree, would be that, do you have the desire to have bottom surgery? Do you feel dysphoric about what's in your legs? And nowadays the community is saying that like, you don't have to have dysphoria about that to be considered trans. And I think it's created a lot of issues. Not that I have any issues with trans people that have no issues with their genitalia, but I do think it means it's created a lot of issues in society, and it means they're very different from who you and me are.
It's something different, and I'm not judging it. It's just something different. I never had a second of doubt that that's something I wanted. And, I think it's fine for different subtypes to come up, but this is where we need an honest discussion and an honest public policy, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I agree with you on that. It's just I think especially when it comes to young, trans women transitioning, like M to Fs that are under the age of 18, I think a huge way to confirm that like they wouldn't have regrets in the future, especially if they are only male attracted, is to know if they have dysphoria with their genitalia. Because if they don't, I feel like that leaves a lot of room open for them to have regrets in the future.
Yeah,
right. And these are the kind of questions that are not being asked on purpose by the establishment. Yes. They're ruling that out. And I find that very surprising, because it would make perfect sense to do just what you're saying.
It makes too much sense. That's the problem.
I want to get to a few more spicy questions here. I want to make a little drama here.
All right.
All right. So I want to talk. One of the most embarrassing things I've ever seen on Twitter was the project to smear you as a chaser. I guess I just wanted to know, like, there was never, you were a gay man, right? Mm-hmm. Anyone that knows you and hang out, like, you're 100% gay. And to get you denigrated and personally attacked, like you're like, this is a sexual thing in trans women. I've always wanted to ask you, how did that feel? That must have really hurt a lot to have your like integrity attacked like that.
So what happened was Alejandra Caraballo, this was 2 years ago, about right now. If you recall, there was that series that came out on Reuters about pediatric gender care for kids. I thought the series was very good. And there was one in particular that was about largely Kinnan Ross McKinnon's research at York University about detransitioning. And I found the article really interesting because it sounded like something you should really explore. And this was at a time when I was really new to this topic myself. So I went on Twitter and just said, gee, at the time I had like 12,000 followers. So it's kind of a bigger account. But I said it would be good to encourage this kind of research. And Alejandra Caraballo found me and just started railing on me. I just made up all this stuff about what I was supposedly saying. And it was just insane. She just sicked all the furies on me. And one of the things that she said was like, oh, and he's probably a chaser. Which, if people don't know that, the old words, it was tranny chaser, was cut out the first word, which you're not supposed to say anymore. Right. And that was just an absurd suggestion, but there was this really big blow up where Ari and I were upset with one another, and I was upset with her because as I said, I have cancer, and she was really mad about this thing that I read in the Washington Post where I had said that it was a real shame that the American Psychiatric Association was not really analyzing and discussing the nuances of the science of this issue and the way that they once had 50 years prior about homosexuality, that it really just, internal debate and discussion was how they delisted homosexuality from the DSM in 1973. And that kind of debate is not happening now about these trans issues. So Ari was getting really mad at me about having written that, and she started listing these things like, there were more hypothetical examples of why don't we take away your this? Why don't we take away your chemotherapy? And I had just had a CAT scan like 2 weeks prior, and I was really terrified that I was going to have a recurrence and my life was going to be just like wrecked. And so I was very sensitive at the time, and I blew up at Ari, and she took advantage of this and presented this tweet that gave the false impression by squishing two things I had said together, that I was a deranged pervert who was furious with her because she wasn't attracted to me.
Oh my God.
And this was so underhanded. And I'm really frankly shocked because Ari is a public representative of Media Matters. When she tweets, she represents them absolutely. There is no difference between those two entities. And for her to behave that way in public was totally shocking to me.
But Ben, she's done the same thing to me. She took a tweet I made to this California case.
She has files in everyone. They get these things. It's for the ready. They keep them on file in case they need to use it against
100%.
you.
But what I was going to say is for Ari and me, I put out a tweet talking about that case in California, which is basically saying that if teachers find out that that a child is trans, that they can't socially transition that. Hold on, let me finish. That child at school secretly, like behind their back, and they need to alert the parents. Now, I thought really carefully about this, and I understand. I went through most of my adolescence terrified that I was going to get outed. So I very much understand that, and considering the fact that my family disowned me the day I came out, like, it does not surprise me at all. Like, my worries back then were well-founded, so I understand that. But I feel very strongly that you cannot say both ways, that socially transitioning children at school is innocuous, and this is a very dangerous thing where people need health care from. It's either got to be one or the other. And after a lot of thought about this, I do think that parents deserve to know. So in that situation, you can have guidance counselors ready to call CPS if that child is abused. Like, those kids need help. That's my position. And this is a nuanced, thoughtful position that I've spent a lot of time thinking of. What did Ari do? She took that first paragraph talking about like the parents need to be notified and left out all the context of it and destroyed my reputation with a certain crowd, which was a fundamental exercise in dishonesty. And this is my problem with a lot of the trans public figures, that they are exactly as extremist as Gamergate or, Free Palestine or a lot of these other like social media cults that have risen up. It is not a force that's in the interest of pursuing truth, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's vile political ideology that's ultimately self-serving. It supports an activist class that benefits from ratcheting up the temperature of the conversation. The end result is that we're further away from the truth. Trans people end up hurt, and we end up pissing off a lot of people.
We alienate people.
We alienate a lot of people, and it's all to line the pockets of these activists who aren't helping us. And it's very tragic to me that people they implicitly believe that trans people need these people to survive, and without them we're just going to be thrown to the wolves. I don't think people realize just how toxic and destructive this whole environment is.
And I think it caters to that vision of what gender ideology wants at the end of the day, which is to replace biological sex and law with gender identity.
Exactly.
And it's an illusory, it's an illusion, really, because it's never going to be tenable in actual real life. And this is where they'll play to that script. That's what that whole sphere of trans activism does, is it plays to that script and it promises this. And it's like, look where it's gotten us. Trump is now elected. There's so much backlash, and it's only going to get worse as long as this vision is being pushed.
There's a few things Brianna, I think it's important for people to recognize that law and these policies in schools in California is not a kid quietly telling their social study teacher that they think they may be trans. It's if the kid socially transitions with a new name and or pronoun. That's what the real consideration is. And I was discussing with somebody just in my own personal life who's involved with the school, and what this person said is, we as the school are in partnership with raising these kids. We have to have an open dialogue with these kids. And this is something that really crosses a certain Rubicon where we have to inform them, because especially if we're talking about kids that are suicidal, and there are uniform policies in place to protect kids against abuse at home. So you don't need a specific policy necessarily to protect against that, because there's already such a thing as mandatory reporting. So, and just to go back to the Ari situation, to answer your question, the onslaught that I received as a result of her mischaracterizing me in public was so wholly damaging to me personally. The stress that I went through, it was, people ask me what's it like when you get dragged on Twitter like this? And I almost don't want to tell people this, because it just gives them fuel to say, you really can't upset him and ruin his day. But it's an out of body experience. I really often don't even feel I'm within the room. It is so surreal to have that many people trying to ruin your life and to ruin your job and to try to get people to not work with you and that sort of thing. So yes, Ari, you really messed up a good period of my life very successfully through unbelievable dishonesty. And for that reason, though, I'm not ashamed of anything. I didn't do anything wrong except for lose my temper in a situation which was very, very valid, considering that she had brought up my own health history, especially in a time I was really vulnerable about that. So.
And then you say it's unkind to misgender trans people. How do you balance that? That's amazing to me that you can still, I don't know, not take the backlash position.
Luckily I don't take it personally. I made a mistake in losing my temper with her, but other than that, I know my side of the street is clean, and I respect Ari's right to be a woman and that sort of thing. And I have absolutely nothing against that whatsoever, but I don't respect the way that she comports herself.
This is a bigger problem, don't you think, that trans people have with the media? Because look at the way, what's the woman that wrote the gender clinic story? Emily Bazelon for the New York Times. The way we treated her.
For the meat grinder. That was a great story. It was
a fantastic story, very sympathetic to her. We were wildly abusive to her. I have not seen her write anything about trans people since. Is there, I'm asking you if you can share, is there a reluctance of legitimate reporters like you to touch these issues? Understanding how
100%. There is terror in journalists and there's terror in editors. And those terror, they're different sort of motivations, journalists don't want to have their reputation run through the mud. Once you step over that line and you say anything slightly critical or perceived to be critical about gender medicine, you get a page on Andrea James's website. Yeah. So she has this hate website, and there are pages of everyone who's ever done anything wrong, the way she sees it, about the gender world. And if you're really bad, you get this ghoulish cartoon of your face. I haven't hit that level, but she calls everyone an anti-trans activist, and no one knows for sure. There are theories, which I don't want to say out loud, about why this is, but she has somehow effectively manipulated the Google algorithm so that those pages are very high on your Google search for your name. So we're talking about professionals who work in media, who are psychologists, who are parents. I had a person tell me that page about them, they're a professor, is very concerning for schools. Like if they were applying to like a private school for their kids, or like their parents, the parents of their kids' friends might look them up and think that they're evil. There is an entire system out there to terrify. And somebody recently criticized me for being hyperbolic about this, for describing this as a cabal. But I'm sorry, but it is. The reason that people like me are few and far between is because they're terrified of losing their jobs. They're terrified of their reputation being dragged through the mud. They don't have the personal strength to stand there and to be just absolutely destroyed online. I grew up under the tyranny of a household bully. To have somebody who spent their entire time around me to tell me that I was worthless and should disappear and never be heard from. I barely spoke at home as a child. Unless I was alone with my mother, I did not speak as a child. So to go through that kind of an upbringing, to survive it, similar to, I think, to what you're feeling about your own gender identity, you have to develop this core sense of strength. I know who I am, and I know what those people say about me is wrong. And I think a lot of people, like, my brothers will sort of beat on me and be like, this is for your own good. Like, we're building you up to be tough. And in a way they were right, but like, thanks a lot. It's not the best way to learn those lessons. But like, I can take it in a way that a lot of other people just can't. So it creates this enormous, people like Ari and Alejandro Caraballo, who attack us so brutally in public. It creates a very, very effective chilling effect. They're very powerful. And they've been kind of confounded that they haven't been able to scare me off. So, but I don't want to sit there and say I'm running from a reactionary position where like I'm getting revenge on them. It's more that I will keep doing what I'm doing regardless of what you guys try to do to me.
I think you've been remarkably measured given the abuse that you've gotten. So I have a couple more questions I want to ask you before we go. What do you as a gay man make of this LGBT drop the T movement? Do you consider trans women like us part of the LGBT? Are you an LGBT kind of guy or an LGBT kind of guy? And why?
It is sort of curious that we're all kind of thrown together in a basket, because our paths towards getting to be a sexual and gender minority, is another way of putting it, are quite different. So in a way, it's sort of odd bedfellows, but in other ways, it makes sense to group us together. So I think that the people, and I'm forgetting the names of their organizations, like Justine, I can't remember her last name. Certain people who have these nonprofits that do want to drop the T. I think they're definitely representative of that reactionary effect of the extremism on the other side, and it's a shame that we can't all get along. But at the same time, I think what I hear from a lot of lesbians in particular is they're really concerned about the way that the lesbian community used to be is being degraded slowly and divided. And this idea that you can't be a lesbian, you have to be a butch lesbian anymore, you have to be a man, that they're really sad to see what they thought as their community dissipate. I think it's very different. The gay male community hasn't really changed that much, although I do see a lot more younger guys sort of at least experimenting with sort of great effeminate, being very feminine and wearing makeup, that kind of thing. But I think it's not as much, and I can't comment as sort of expertly on the lesbian community necessarily.
So it sounds like a very weak endorsement of LGBT to me.
I guess you could put it that way, because I don't necessarily know that our quote unquote communities naturally overlap as much as you might think.
So?
I mean, just
because we're the same age, you know what it used to be, Ben. Like I go to a really gay gym. There's nothing but gay guys there. I see gay guys everywhere. So just in my everyday perambulating, I don't necessarily overlap with trans people or lesbians that much. So
it's just that's just my own vision in terms of like what I see from day to day. I'd have to sort of like make more of an effort to reach out to interact with the other letters and the alphabet people, as Chappelle calls us.
I will also say I understand this impulse because there's the same thing within the trans community where trans people are like, do I really have all that much in common with non-binary people? And non-binary people have
what about asexuals,
Or asexuals. But yeah, I mean, just, focusing on people who have a gender identity that is like slightly different from ours. Like, I identify as a woman. They don't identify as a woman. It seems like fairly close. And yet I understand that like in some ways there's like a gulf of difference between us. And sometimes that's really relevant. So I definitely get the desire to be like, I think LGBT makes sense to group together. But I understand how there are these major differences.
It's partly that we're seen as others by other people. And so we're all sort of back together because we're stigmatized. I think that's what we all have in common, for one thing.
And also because it fundamentally relates to expectations about your gender, right? So there's an expectation that like, if your gender, or if your sex is male, that you are attracted to women and that you wear men's clothes and that you don't have breasts and whatnot. But we break that expectation just in different ways, right? And so I think it's very important that people not be pigeonholed according to their natal sex, fundamentally forced into a certain rut in life. And so for me, that's the connection. But I understand that those behaviors are different. And so it's worth
I grew up in the 80s. My mother wouldn't allow me to get a lavender t-shirt when I was 6 years old. It was a really big deal to me. That's one of the reasons, you can't really see it, but my rug is lavender. And that is one of the reasons why it's still pushing back again. I wasn't allowed to have new female friends after the age of 6.
Wow. What?
They grandfathered in one girl that I'm still friends with her. So like, and then I was like, screw this when I was 16 and I joined a pretty girl clique. It was so much fun. And so like gender boundaries absolutely affect me as well, but in a different way. They're partly a reflection of my sexuality, but it's not a reflection of my having a different gender identity per se. But
I think one of the reasons I think one of the reasons I'm really frustrated by this LGB drop the T movement is historically, like, no offense, man, you're great, I love you. But historically, gay men have been really shitty allies to trans women. Like, if you look for the push to gay marriage, legislating this in states, I invite anyone to go look at the history. What is the first poker chip that the gay men running HRC threw in the pile with every single opportunity to push gay rights along? It was us.
It's kind of like the suffragettes, pushing aside the needs of Black women.
Exactly the same.
Interesting.
Shirley Chisholm in the 70s and all that, very similar.
Now, I want to be clear. I see the way that lesbians are treated by this iteration of the trans movement. It horrifies me. Like if you're into women, like, God bless, no judgment. But the way it was when I transitioned is there was an understanding that you needed immense sensitivity about entering those spaces and that you were not entitled to be there, that you could earn your space there with a certain threshold of behavior. But like when I see lesbian friends of mine talking about like people on these apps talking about, sucking their girl dick or whatever, like, it is horrifying behavior. So I understand why the trust has been broken. But I think, again, historically, I feel like there's this reversal of the victim order here. And historically, trans women have been treated like shit by LG and B. And it's like, this is the time where we really, really need that solidarity, because I am connected enough in Congress to have an inkling of what's coming down the pipe. And this is going to be a hell of a 4 years for us. So it feels very self-involved, if that makes sense to you.
So a little piece of history. So in 2015, when the Obergefell decision came out of the Supreme Court that legalized same-sex marriage across the country, I went down to Stonewall here in New York City. There was this great rally. It was really exciting and lots of speakers. And I always like to say that I was there at the moment that the trans right movement really grew out of the old gay movement. And it was like the fifth speaker, and it was a trans woman. I don't know who she was, but she got up and she was pissed. And she said, all right, you gay guys, like, you got what you want. Don't you leave us in the dust.
That's right.
And in New York State, the Empire State Pride agenda was solely devoted to trying to get gay marriage legalized, and they succeeded, and they closed down. And that enraged a lot of the trans rights activists in particular, because they felt that they could have remodeled themselves. And then that in fact is often a criticism of GLAAD. We've seen these arguments that, GLAAD should have just shut down because, gay rights, they're fine now. And then they had to go into the trans stuff, and now they've gone bananas. But it really, 2015 was such a turning point. That was right when the Time Magazine article came out with the trans tipping point with Laverne Cox.
I was horrified that day. I wish that had never come out. Tell me
why, that moment was really when what we see now as the trans rights movement begins. And it was the next year that what's called Section 1557 in the Affordable Care Act, that the Obama administration changed that to say that you can't discriminate on gender identity just as with sex. And so that, as you're saying, was how the Obama administration made it so that there was much more insurance coverage for all of us, as you were referring earlier. So tell me, why do you have a problem with that, Laverne Cox? I met her once. I was once in a show with her, and she was so lovely, I just want to say.
Yeah, well, it's because, did it work out well for the Jews in Germany being super visible? I think trans people are always safest when we're kind of invisible.
Yeah, but some people think that that's bad to be too stealth. Why do you have to apologize?
I mean, look, there are valid techniques both ways, but I think the problem right now is trans people are so hyper visible. And my life was much, much better when people weren't thinking about this all the time. Like, the amount of information people have about stuff like dilation is just astonishing to me. Or understanding the testosterone markers, like brow ridges. This was not common knowledge 10 years ago. So I think it's so much harder to pass today because people are so much more tuned into the issue.
It's kind of like how AIDS made people talk about homosexuality all the time in the 80s.
100%.
It was for the better in the end because we had to discuss it, but in the short term, it was absolutely terrible.
Yeah. All right. Anyone, Taff, I kind of cut you off. Did you have anything you wanted to say? Or I've got one last question if you don't.
I guess on the note about suffragettes and Black women and the sort of desire to cut off one part of the community as at least a bargaining chip or something. I think it's one of the reasons why I feel such a strong need to defend non-binary people or people who are AGP, autosexual. I think, or people, who just have lower dysphoria, right? I think that fundamentally there needs to be an argument that is strong enough to protect all groups, right? To say that only white women should get voting rights. I think it's fundamentally a weak argument. And it's much stronger ultimately to defend voting rights for all women, all people. And
all people can be different, and that's okay. And not tolerate, but celebrate difference, which I always want to say.
Yeah, totally. I think you sort of kick the can down the road if you just, advocate for white women. So I feel that very strongly. And that is just a big part of my approach to all of this, is trying to find that position that is more true to what's actually going on here. And so that's why I talk so much about freedom and responsibility. It's hard. It's really complicated. But I think that's where it has to ultimately go.
I think that's fair. I think it's sometimes hard, if you're in the public policy space, because what are the public policy proposals being pushed by serious people for non-binary people? I think when it expands to stuff like the California law that lets someone non-binary just fill out a form and then go into a women's locker room and wave their dick around, that's a serious public policy conflict that I don't think it serves trans women to be in the middle of. So I'm open to a public policy solution there that works for everyone. From my point of view there, it really feels like everyone, especially in the non-binary space, is such a maximalist when it comes to gender ideology. It's hard to pick I'm with you on the freedom argument, but if you're going for concrete changes to law and policy and WPATH and standards, we don't have any clinical criteria that are worth a damn for like diagnosing what a non-binary person is. The WPATH like document standards of care on how to treat non-binary people. Go read it. It's a page and a half, and it just basically says pick your own gender role. So I think it would be easier for me to do that if there were a coherent public policy agenda that wasn't just destroy all gender and announce your pronouns, if that makes sense.
And this is not really about non-binary, but just about how the law can be, these conflicts are irreconcilable, and judges will have to decide. In the San Jose volleyball player case, both sides are using Title IX to argue for their point of view, saying Title IX protects trans girls' right to be in women's sports, or it protects women's rights to have their single-sex spaces. And one side will have to win. This will go, who knows, maybe it'll end up in the Supreme Court. But this is a serious problem, and just sticking your hand in the sand and saying that there isn't nuance on either side of this is not exactly helping the public discourse. I was in this group of people who were, I was talking with a mom who had these, very elite swimming children, and they all went to major schools, they were recruited. And she was only talking about like keeping men out of, women's sports and that kind of thing. And I said to her, well, what is fair for the trans woman, the trans girl? Her head exploded. And the problem is, like, some of these arguments are irreconcilable. One side will have to win. Either you're in or you're out. This is a binary choice. And it's really painful because, Leah Thomas would hopefully have a right to compete as best she can. But the question is, like, is your right limited? Do you have to swim in the men's division and be, 400th?
It's that whole question of like, does it infringe on women's rights or natal women? Because this is the problem. I mean, I see this with like balancing, like TAP has put out, like, it needs to be sort of expansive and respect human autonomy in the sense that some people might want to might benefit from HRT, but not a full transition. But then when you come to the actual policy implications of granting provisions for transgender women, then you run into problems because not everyone is really fitting that standard of what you think when you imagine a transgender woman, like we've all talked about here.
There are only men's or women's bathrooms or, just single serve. We don't have a third option. Right? There is not a third option in sports. So unless we create those third options, either you're in or you're out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is besides the point, but I do think it's totally absurd that the government is expected to prop up women's sports when they are just objectively not as valuable as men's sports. And the fact that the government is like so involved in this causes so many issues. Which is awesome. And, love that for the free market. But you see in these colleges and universities, there's a certain number of slots that are allocated for women and a certain amount of money that legally has to be given to these programs. And it makes them incredibly competitive, and it distorts the reality of accessing these schools and these privileges because everyone wants, a piece of that pie. And suddenly it gets really competitive in a way that is probably not natural. And so in so many ways, we just need, again, not the topic of the discussion, totally besides the point, but I would love to see the government making us less responsible for these issues, because I think if a private organization wants to have like trans women and women competing together or doesn't, totally great. But the problem is that like we as a society are forced to buy into whatever the government's deciding, and suddenly everyone has a stake in this and a really strong opinion on whether or not trans women are women, which is probably not healthy.
I love that the longer we do this show, the more based libertarian tone. It's finally coming out.
Like, there's no Title IX. Title IX bad.
I love that. Okay, final question, because we got another rest of the show to do. I wanted to do a little bit of healing here on Dollcast today. So the same way that some people were showing showing tweets out of context that you had made, Ben. I was in a tweet thread 3 days ago where someone was attacking my girl, Kelly Cadigan, on Twitter, saying that she had an issue with gay men with the tweet she had put out. So, Kelly, I was wondering if you could just give Ben a little bit of context.
I don't even know what you're talking about.
So, Kelly, I had never heard of you until this June when I saw your video where you're like in the car and you're saying all gay men should transition. And if you don't recall, that went very viral. And so I don't know you. I didn't know if you were joking. And some people have said that you are. I myself was very shocked by the video. I found it very hurtful. So if you were joking, okay. But so I would love to hear from you of like what you meant by that video and how you would like people to have interpreted it. What were you being ironic? I don't even know.
It was my response to kind of just the LGB drop the T situation. I just kind of shortly after that video, I made like a whole like stupid logo for like T drop the G. It's great. It's never too late. Just because it was just my response to them and how foolish they sounded. I obviously don't think all gay men should transition.
I appreciate that because out of context, I had no idea. I don't know your general persona. So I didn't know that. I was really very shocked.
Wait. So are we not going to Ben's house after the show and
we're gonna like tie you down and transition?
In a way, though, I thought it was valid because the LGB drop the T movement, they're essentially saying that people like us, right? Like
you were making an ironic
we should
statement.
Go be gay men, right? Instead of just like being trans women. So I was like, okay, well, if you're going to say that, I'm just going to say you guys should be forced to be trans women, especially if you're bottoms.
I appreciate it as a form of performance art in that sense. So now I get it, but at the time I really didn't. So I don't know how you add that like a little like asterisk in the middle of your video. This is a joke. I'm being ironic to comment on the social mores of our time.
No, that's half the fun. Half the fun is letting people think it's real.
You're a provocatrice.
Okay, to be fair though, Ben, I have known a few gay men to have an acerbic sense of humor that's a little bit dark.
Oh, sure.
On occasions, I feel like Kelly can make a joke or two, and it doesn't like.
I really appreciate that. Now I kind of like the video in a way because I appreciate that you were being really wicked, and I kind of like that way of just like stirring the pot a bit. So it's when you came, the way you were behaving, you were purposely coming across as an airhead, like the way you were talking,
Yeah.
And so now I understand that you were being really sardonic. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm sorry that if it came across in a way that like
we have a healing. I love this. Wouldn't it be amazing if like Alejandro Caraballo watched this whole video and they're like, they're all getting along. He's not really a transphobe. What will I do to destroy him now? And, all this kind of thing. So I don't know.
All right. Final thoughts, anybody?
It saddens me that when people think of the trans community, those are the names that come to their mind. Like, I feel like that's so commonly heard. And like, we should want better research in trans medicine, like in gender medicine.
Yeah.
I want better research. I want to know the people that stand to benefit from this transitional treatment because there's too many detransitioners and they seem to be growing that are coming in and saying, oh, it's all a facade. It's all wrong. It's just harmful to the body. And it's like, look, I know there's risks to estrogen. I researched those in depth. That was the whole point of like doing that, exploration before I transitioned. And I still wanted this treatment. And I fully recognize that, there may be some harms long-term, but I'm still happier. And I would rather choose this than I would have before. And I want that.
And you chose, you felt the balance was on this end, you understood the risks,
Right. Because I had that informed. I was informed. And it's like, that's actual gender medicine, like informing people and giving them a little bit of breaks to, like, I hate to say the word gatekeeping, but a little bit of that is healthy. It's good. And we got to get away from this model of this inevitable, unquestionable essence of gender identity in people. And you can't push back at all. It's like, no, you need to push back. That's what medicine is. And it's helping people figure out that process.
I think the average person on the liberal side doesn't understand that indeed the science is weak. They think that that's just a smokescreen. Oh, the science is weak for everything. And like, yes, for a lot of things that don't come with these risks, because the risks are so high, the known risks about infertility and sexual dysfunction, therefore that raises the bar. And I don't think people on the left understand how uninvested the research endeavor is in answering a lot of these questions. They're not interested in creating more effective, quote unquote, gatekeeping or psychosocial assessments, is what they're called. In fact, they're interested in degrading them and getting rid of them. Boston Children's used to allot 20 hours in 2007 to 2006, about 14 or so, for the psychologists to assess these kids and to write the reports on them. That got whittled down to 2.5 hours by 2018. And this was kept secret until it came out in a court case last month. And that's really telling when they're telling you Michael Hobbs will go on his podcast and say, oh, there's no evidence anyone's rushing these kids. The first clinic to ever do this, Boston Children's, is the most prestigious pediatric clinic in the world, if not possibly in the world, but it's definitely in the country. If they're doing it in 2.5 hours, that's one 2-hour appointment with kids and then with their parents. How can you not call that rushing? It's amazing to me.
I hear what you're saying about the evidence, though, Ben. I feel like this is put out there, though, to like it's not my fault. It's not the trans community's fault that for 40 years, the main people willing to do research about this are shitty, underqualified grad students, like doing surveys to pass out to undergrads, and that very little NIH money has come out of here to do hard studies. Like, if anything, this is, I feel like it's twisted around as this argument against the trans community. The way I interpret that is this is how little anyone has given a shit about us.
These are the best people representing us. Thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah,
you're not bringing your best.
I mean, honestly, it's like sometimes I'm not going to give his name, but there's a mutual friend of ours, and he'll often put out critiques about the level of evidence-based medicine for trans healthcare. And like, I understand it. I hear you. But like, where the hell were you 40 years ago when trans women could have used this stuff? We are out here. We've been trying to survive, and many of us have not been, like, for 40 years. So like I wish you'd stop talking, not you, but I wish people would stop talking about us like we're just pulling this out of nowhere. Like, no one has been helping us. It is insane.
Yeah, it's not an indictment on the trans community. That like it's really hard to get these studies, and it's very frustrating for like all trans people because we want the strong evidence. However, it lays because we want people with gender dysphoria to live happy, healthy lives.
How do we help people?
That's
what it boils down to. Yeah.
And if therapy is fully necessary and we need that plus transition, whatever it works out to be, we need to know that. And it really is just this like activist group that does not benefit from helping us. They benefit from continually pushing a certain conversation and narrative and attacking and destroying people like you when you're willing to like maybe raise a flag, quite frankly, in defense of us and in defense of people who might end up as detransitioners. We need people like you, frankly, the only kind of people who I respect, who are willing to actually take a stand for something real.
I mean, it's amazing to be in this group of you women, to have such a nuanced conversation like this. Like, this is what we need all over the place. Like, I really hope people watch this video. I think people would get a lot out of it. And for one thing, just witnessing people having a dialogue, we're not strangling each other across the airwaves,
No.
But granted, we also don't have points of view in here. Like, if Alejandro Caraballo were here, we would have a different dialogue. Wouldn't that be interesting? Like, I would totally do that. I would totally... And that was one of the things I had been just discussing with Ari before she blew up at me and I blew up at her in the spring. I had just reached out to her and said, why don't we have like some sort of a webcast where we have people of different points of view? She was not okay with that. I don't want to divulge just totally private conversation, but she turned it down. Let's just put it that way. And that's a shame because that's what we need and not, character assassinations on Twitter.
Yeah.
That's not progress.
I do want to say, Ben, like, I don't think I would have Alejandro on the show. Like, when we were designing the show, one of the things we decided, like, as a group, is we didn't want it to be shouty. Like, I love me some Destiny. I watch plenty of those things, but the world does not need another like drama-based, like conflict-heavy, show about trans issues. And I have people that reach out to me all the time asking to be on here, and I look at their social media and I ask for video clips of them discussing this, and I'm like, you can't be an adult. And that goes both ways, like for the gender critical side and the trans activist side. So if you're going to be screamy or you can't act like an adult and defend your positions, this is not a show for you. Like so,
would you have Nancy Mace on?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. What's that?
Nancy Mace? Oh,
yeah, 100%.
Yeah, she's had quite the performance this past week.
That is, we actually talked about that in our first segment. So
Yeah. And it's, I want to stress too, like, we're not afraid to talk with people that don't agree with us. Actually, we think there's a lot of value in that because it makes for a more enriching. It's got to be good faith, right? Like, we're all respectful here. We're all adults. Like, we want to treat each other in that way. And we want to have good dialogue. We don't want to be name calling, whatever it's called, where that fallacy where you're attacking the person ad hominem, that whole thing. Like, we're trying to get like good discussions across to get all the different viewpoints to show like who is best served by gender medicine and what does good medicine look like? What does good trans rights actually look like? Because this is something I've been thinking about more and more as I'm seeing the clash between women's rights and then issues with children. And it's like, what does really good trans rights look like? And I like having those dialogues and seeing what others think.
I mean, look how Kelly or Brianna disagree with me. It's like, it's so quiet. I never feel
get out.
Down. Exactly. But I think it's so valuable. Like, I love when they do that because that is how we create something that is better than like just my, beliefs or just theirs. It's greater than the sum of its parts. And I think it's so important to have the conversation fundamentally predicated on a respect and a desire for truth. And it's hard to do that if you're talking to someone who's totally dug in, who's willing to use those personal attacks. So
podcasts are a little bit more interesting when they disagree. Like if I hear R.S. Wisher disagree with Andrew Sullivan, I love that. One of the things I just like the most about Michael Hobbs's podcast is it's filled with this. Yeah. They always agree with one another. And that's just paralytically boring for one thing.
Well, it's very easy to talk to you with respect, Taff, because I adore you. I think you're literally the best. So the 10% that I disagree with you on, I don't want to disagree because I don't, but there it is.
But no, it's good. Yeah.
You can disagree without disrespecting.
No, of course.
That's ideal human interaction,
So, oh my goodness. All right. So
Mace could do that though. Would she be able to have an argument in good faith? Because I feel like
I would be very interested to know. I would be very interested to see that conversation.
Let me work on magic. We'll see what happens.
Reach out to her. Like, that could be really big if you got her on here. Like, you would get a lot of views. Nothing else.
I know a lot of people, Ben. That's all I'm going to say. All right. I think that's a good place to end it. Ben, where can people follow your work?
Okay. So my Substack is benryan.substack.com. X and Blue Sky, Ben Ryan Writer. My website is benryan.net. Thanks a lot.
I want to thank you. You wrote the best description of me in one of the pieces you ever wrote. I really hope someone goes and edits it into Wikipedia, where you're like, nice. Brianna Wu is not here to make friends.
Well, what I said was, you could use that old adage about reality TV, that she's not here to make friends, but she is. I mean, you're trying to bridge these gulfs, and sometimes that's not possible, mind you. And because you say things sort of from the middle, you offend people on either side, and that alienates them. And what can you do? But like, ultimately, your central purpose right now is to use the voice that you still have, considering you have this health condition. It's just like so. It's so sadly poetic. It's stealing your voice. Like, you're in a rush to use that while you still have it. I think that's really beautiful.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate that. I think what you're doing is very helpful too. And I think you're one of the best allies the trans community has. And I hope every single trans person watches this and gets the fuck off your back, because it's not appropriate. Let's get some straight reporting.
Part of the job, but it's unpleasant. But like,
it doesn't have to be as personal as
I know where my heart lies, and I think at the core of this, if you are a decent human being, what you say is, especially about the kids issue, like, how do we best care for these kids? These kids are here. They're very distressed in different ways. And we want to have a system that can best care for them. And the best system is one where there's daylight and transparency. 100%. And we've not seen that. And we've seen the W path has not been transparent, and behind the scenes has been manipulating their guidelines unscientifically to win court battles and to get insurance coverage. and that they
Yep.
themselves are fully aware of the weakness of the science, and that that's not just a trifle as it would be if you gave a kid some Tylenol.
Oh my
you know?
goodness. All right, you're gonna have to come back on Dollcast. This is not gonna be the last time you're here, Ben.
Yeah, this was amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you
You
so
guys are
much for
great.
coming.
I'm really glad, Kelly, that I figured that out, that you were joking. And now I think it's kind of awesome because sometimes I like to stir the pot too. So it was a kind of performance art that was very political. So now I find it fascinating.
Yeah, no, I'm glad we
I
sorted
love
that
it.
out.
I really did, because I was actually very upset.
It was hilarious.
It is hilarious. Now I understand the context. But,
Well, if you know Kelly,
Yeah.
I didn't. I'd never heard of her, so that was why I was like, "Who is this little twerp?"
A lot of people took it and blew it out of proportion, out of
Yeah.
context. So,
Right.
like, yeah,
The boy's like, how could I not, since I didn't know you? So that's kind of
Right.
like
Yeah.
what the wall you're up against when you're trying to do something like that is if people don't know who you are, they don't get the joke. Per se.
Amazing.
So,
All right. Thanks for coming,
right.
Ben. I'm gonna remove you
Bye,
from
everybody.
stage now.
yeah.
Talk to you
Thank
soon.
you.
all right.